Hi everyone, I'm here today with Simon from the Rune Keep, and we are going to have another DM chat, this time about the topic of railroading in TTRPGs. I think it's a topic that we're all familiar with, and have all walked into one way or another at some point. Mainly because I think that everyone has different definitions of the topic, so I think that it's something really interesting for us to kind of chat about and see if we can gather any new insights by going over it. So I am currently the host, Kevin from Chaotic Stupid Media. We also play Tales of Adaea every week on Sundays at 6 p.m. CEST, so please join us then as well. But that's my introduction. Simon, maybe you'd like to say a little bit as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm the DM of the Ruin Keep, which is a stream on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. On Twitch, Ruin Keep. And we currently have a special guest who's been with us for a few weeks, playing a guest character in Kevin. It's been wonderful having you on the stream. Thank you very
It's
much
been
for
amazing to
joining
be
us.
there. You run a game so well, and the players are so much fun. Um, and it just makes me want to work with you guys so much more. I just want to do all the things, podcasts and more streams and more games, and there's not enough time in the week, unfortunately.
That is true. Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, today railroading, which I'm really excited about actually, because I think it's such an interesting topic.
Mm.
And yeah, like I said, I think that people. Hi everyone in the chat, by the way. Welcome to the stream as well. We appreciate you. But I think railroading is just so interesting because people experience it so differently.
Mm.
Some people love to have a game where everything is on rails. That there's a path and you can make some choices to like go left or right, but that's about it.
Yeah,
And other people just want the sandbox experience, which I have some opinions about as well. But we have prepared some questions, like we as we like to do. So I'm just going to
yeah.
dive right in with the first one. Do you mind if I take one of the ones from your list, because it's such a
Sure.
great opening question to say, what does railroading mean to you?
So I think railroading, like a lot of things in my view, is a kind of scale. So you can move that scale up and down. At the furthest point, railroading is creating a very clear boundary that you're not going to allow players to go beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So it's forcing them down a certain direction, but it's also preventing them from interacting with parts of the world that you don't want them to. So that's kind of the extreme end.
Yeah.
And I think one of the hardest things, say, of running a module, prepared module, is the fact that if the players want to do anything that isn't already written down in that module, then you are effectively going to have to railroad them somehow
Yeah.
or start improvising a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, railroading at the extreme end is controlling the players and preventing them from going past some boundaries that you've put into place.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think I would probably add to that, because that's probably like the first thing for me that comes to mind is it's preventing them from doing things in a way that they experience as negative.
Right.
Because you can do it, I think you can do it in a very positive way as well.
Yes. Yes.
Like giving them the boundaries to kind of bounce off of, and then redirect them into the story, which you could, I suppose, call railroading as well, but that's probably
Mm.
less extreme on that scale that you described. Let me really quickly turn off the Nightbot commands. Yeah, I think for me, railroading is distinctly A, preventing your players from engaging in a part of the story that they want to, and B, doing that and leaving a negative taste, in a negative experience in its wake, where they are left with, hey, I hated that happened because I really wanted to do that, and I still don't understand why I can't do that. Or even worse, I have to do this, even though I don't want to be doing this.
Mm.
And I think that the negative part is probably a pretty big part of it, which is starting to make me realize that maybe I railroad more than I expected.
I do have some questions later on for directed at that. Yeah, I just wanted to say hi to Haratir Larinki and
Yeah,
Kieran. Hi, Tempest Games. Thanks for joining us.
yeah. Thank you for joining us.
Oh,
Yeah.
and Master. Cool.
Mm. Space,
Um,
spaceman is
yeah,
here.
but yeah, I think railroading has a connotation that it's negative.
Hmm.
It's used as a criticism.
Yeah.
But I think that's simplifying the topic. I think that railroading has its place and should be used as a tool.
Yeah.
I think every DM has to railroad to an extent because you can't control and design an entire world
Hmm.
or
Yeah.
universe or whatever. So there are limitations to what you can plan, and therefore you have to steer the players in different ways. The question is, are those ways too overt? Are you sort of
Yeah.
hammering the players like a nail, or are you doing it in a subtle way that encourages them?
Yeah.
So for me, railroading is kind of a tool that you can use in
Hmm.
different ways that can be effective, or it could be disastrous.
So I think I was going to save this one for later, but I think based on that, it's a really interesting question to ask. Can you give an example of where you subtly railroaded the players, for example, on the Ruined Keep, guided them in a particular direction, or is that something you wouldn't want to provide
No,
examples of?
I can talk about that. Yeah, for sure. I mean, when we decided on this topic, I started thinking about the very recent sessions.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, a way of railroading in a way that players will accept is the world turns, events continue,
Mm.
whether the players want them to or not. And in order to make the world as alive as possible, you want NPCs, you want other characters to interact and do things regardless of what the players have done.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a momentum that is kind of a bit like railroading. So in the recent Ring Keep stream, there are some big events that have kicked off because of NPCs and large scale country conflicts and things happening. And it's beginning to impact you. You're a guest on
Yeah.
the stream and you can see these events happening. And it forces the players in a certain direction and a certain set of choices,
Yeah.
but in a way that still gives them plenty of opportunity to say, "Ha! I don't care about any of this. I'm going to just go off," which is also fine by me. But there is a certain amount of railroading, I think, in sweeping the players up in
Right.
events and carrying them forward.
I mean, with under like using that perspective, I think that you could almost argue that just presenting plot hooks could be construed as the most basic form of
Yeah.
railroading that you essentially have to learn, which is a really good point in favor of railroading is not by default an evil thing, but rather just something that you have to guide players onto their path in some way. Because, I mean, I would say that no matter how big the sandbox or how many different opportunities you provide, you have to provide these hooks that people can grab onto and get pulled along with. Because if you provide genuinely nothing, then I think you would have sessions upon sessions of players just talking to random NPCs until one happens to be the right one, which I think would probably not be really good entertainment for anybody anyway, and it would give a DM probably the biggest headache in the world.
I totally agree, and I think to give an example of what I would consider bad railroading, if you set up a very sort of trope heavy beginning of a campaign, you had one NPC sitting alone in a tavern with a mysterious hood over their head,
Yeah.
and the party all meet and gather in this tavern, and that's where they're starting. And when they talk to people in the tavern, the conversations are short and pointless, unless they talk to this NPC who's got the hood. And then when the NPC says, I don't know, my daughter's been kidnapped and I need someone to go and rescue her. If you don't say yes and you don't agree to take that mission, then there is nothing else for you to do. that for me is an example of the worst kind of
Yeah.
railroading. But in a similar fashion, you've got to start somewhere, as you said.
Mhm.
And so, if you're going to do that scenario well, then you probably want to throw in, say, 3 NPCs who've got 3 different missions that the
Yeah.
players could pick up. It's still railroading. You're just giving a bit more choice. And like you said, the plot hooks are a form of railroading in a way.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but
it can be a way that gives the player choice.
I think thinking about it, the way that you described it just now makes me consider also that there's 2 different ways to sort of entice players to engage with a plot hook, right? You can either push or pull, or essentially try to attract them, or try to just tell them you have to do this. And I think that, for example, also even if you have only the one hook, obviously you have to be able to survive without it, or you have to find a way to always introduce it. But I think definitely one way that I like to not avoid railroading, but to not make it feel like you're being forced to do something, is to make the options enticing enough. To make it, to make sure that obviously the players are engaged enough, and thankfully my players are extremely engaged, and I think yours are too. So we have it kind of easy there. But
No, obviously Hrathia is the least engaged.
I wouldn't say so. I think
That's only because he's in chat.
he's very very engaged in all the killing and smashing people. but yeah, I think when you start to play, you obviously agree to be engaged to a certain degree anyway. So if you can just feed your players' curiosities, then automatically they will start to take hold of things. Sometimes even things that you hadn't planned on, but the story starts moving forward. And I think the whole point of railroading or guiding or anything like that, right, is to get the story in motion, to get moving somewhere. And sometimes you move the world forward to keep things in motion, and sometimes the players move the world forward because that's just where they were going. But for me, I think definitely the most fun are those times when it's really just the players just grabbing hold of everything and just pulling themselves in constantly, and they're just going and going and going. Sometimes, that can kind of lead to an opposite effect where I have to try to slow them down a bit, just because maybe I don't have that far in advance prepared, and in one session they go from point A to B, C, D, and then it's E, and I'm like, I wasn't at E yet, so calm down and let's play next session again. Have you ever had that where they actually start to pull too much at certain threads?
While you were talking, I was thinking that my problem is that the players that I tend to have in the campaign are so focused and so interested that they can spend way too long on A and never get to B.
That is also familiar.
Which I really enjoy, but it does mean that I don't worry that much about running out of E.
Right.
Obviously, there are surprise directions that a player can go in, so they can go A, B, and then Z, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
How did you manage that? But I think that if you give a wealth of information and interest in your world to the players from the beginning, so my example of that tavern with the single NPC, as soon as you fill the tavern with interesting characters who've all got conflicts and story and drama going on, then you're feeding so much information to the players that they get to enjoy whatever interaction they want.
Yeah.
And that, in a way, slows down how much ABC you need prepared.
Yeah.
And
So
you don't need railroading as much that way.
So have you ever used the trick where, players have 2 different choices, but they end up in roughly the same encounter? I saw a very funny picture, I think it was on Twitter the other day, where you saw 2 different hallways, but we had the isometric view, and both hallways just ended up in the same Red Dragon encounter. So whether you went to the mountain or you went to the lake, both could have a similar villain. It's just that it eliminates that villain from appearing in the other place if you then later on go to the other place still.
Not really, because the way that I prepare an encounter or a situation, a scenario that the players are going to interact with,
Mm.
is kind of like a bunch of spinning plates that are all interacting with each other offline, off session.
Yeah.
These are things that are happening regardless of what the players do, and each action that the player takes is to change another plate that's spinning.
Right.
So the only thing that would happen is maybe two plates that I want them to get to at some point might move and appear somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Because, so for example, if there's an NPC who I want them to fight with at some point, that NPC might be waiting in this tavern with a cloaked hood, expecting the party to turn up, and pretty much I can guarantee the party just won't. They'll go straight past the tavern and breeze on, and go somewhere else. But instead of just lifting the NPC and dropping them somewhere else, all I'm doing is deciding, well, that NPC, their motivation, their task would take them somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that means you lose that scenario completely. But I'm happy to do that because that's how I want the session to go.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think I've done it both ways, both the way that you described and, having the two paths that lead to the same thing. But I mainly do the two paths that lead to the same thing when it's just a fun encounter that I'm not attached to necessarily from a story perspective. So especially, I think I did this early or on when I started DMing 5e especially. There were just, sometimes you just get a new source book or something. I was like, this is a cool monster. I don't necessarily have a clear path for it to insert it very closely. So there's maybe a contract or several contracts, and each of them could just lead to a different version of the same encounter because I wanted the players to have that. But I think, from a story perspective, I don't think you can necessarily do that as easily. Just because you said, characters have different motivations. NPCs have the same issue in that they're not going to be around forever. And like you said, the world moves on. It keeps turning.
Yeah, and to give a simple example, there's in the Rune Keep stream, the princess that you've been talking to as a guest. The party's original mission back from episode 1 was to find this woman, and at some point I knew she was in the jungle, and so obviously I'd prepared a bunch of encounter, if you like, that they would have with her. And for all I knew, they wouldn't ever go into the jungle. There was a moment when they almost didn't.
Really?
Oh yeah. They'd gone up the cliff and done a bit of investigation, and they had a choice. They could go back to the boat and go off and do something else, or go into the jungle. I had no idea which they'd choose.
Right.
And as far as I was concerned, if they didn't go into the jungle, then the princess who was in the jungle would have just been in the jungle for a bit longer, and at some point would have left the jungle. But that's a price I'm willing to pay.
How severely do you think that would have impacted the story? Would they still have encountered her in some fashion, or would it have genuinely changed the larger picture overall?
Well, this is what I love about this method of DMing, because it makes it so interesting from my point of view. It gives me so much material to work with. If they'd gone off and if they'd left the jungle and just gone back to the keep or something, then I would need completely new things for them to be doing.
Yeah.
And I assume, therefore, they'd be doing those things. And then at some point, the princess would go out in the jungle, and they'd encounter her in a completely different setup. Which for me is actually quite exciting. I like that idea of, I wonder where they might encounter her now that they've just missed her entirely.
I love hitting that part of the campaign where you've done enough sessions where even the material that you've had to discard earlier can still reappear again. Characters that were sitting in a tavern but that they didn't engage with then have completed part of their journey so that they can reappear somehow in the player's stories. I'm really fond of that, and because you know how large my world is as well. There's a lot of characters that I like to introduce that seem throwaways, and then 50 sessions later the players go like, wait, is that? And I love those moments so much, and it's I guess it's like a mini form of quote unquote railroading, in the sense that I do reintroduce them, but they're further along their path. Like you said, some stuff has happened and they're now at a different point in their lives.
So Heracles got a question.
I was about...
Now, So Rati's question is it harder or easier to railroad a player you know well? I had a similar question, which is it easier or harder to railroad full stop?
Uh-huh.
So should we try and answer both those questions all
Yeah.
in one? So do you want to start with Rati?
Okay, I'll start with the question from the chat. Is it easier to railroad a player that you know well? I think so for me, but within the definition of railroading that I maintain, which is kind of expansive in the sense that it also includes, manipulating events so that they go down certain paths that I think will be interesting. Not necessarily that I'm, plotting their character's story, but I do give them a lot of choice, and sometimes there are just moments where it would be. I'm really interested to see whether they will engage or how they will engage with a particular encounter. So I nudge. I nudge in a certain way, and it's easier with players that I know because I know what will interest them. And then we're back to the lure of, okay, how do you get players to engage with the plot hooks that you put in front of them? When I know them, it's much easier to say, okay, I know that you're interested in this, I know what your character's like, I know how you view your character and how you play it, and I can use that information to say, okay, this is what I need to put in front of you, and I know that you're going to engage with it no matter what, because you just can't resist that tasty morsel. Nikolai is a perfect example. I've been playing with him for 4 years, and I mean, he's going to hate me for saying this, but I could probably get him to play in any direction that I need him to in terms of the story, and he'd never know. But I don't, generally, because that's not fun. But when there are really interesting encounters, yeah, I think it's easier to do that with a player you know well because of everything that you know about them.
Yeah, so this reminds me of an earlier question that Kira had, which is railroading just one line or giving lots of option lines? I guess you probably could railroad even with multiple option lines, but typically railroading for a player, I think, feels like there is one line and the DM doesn't want you to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
And so they start blocking your movement. They start stopping you going places, talking to people, getting any information that can take you anywhere else apart from this one direction.
Yeah.
I think if you had lots of options, I guess we'd start saying the scale has moved away from railroading, and now you're getting into more sort of sandbox territory. Do you think that is the sort of other end of the scale? Is railroading the opposite of sandbox?
I don't think so, actually. I think I already touched a little bit on my opinion in particular on sandbox, which is that if you had a true sandbox, it wouldn't be playable because you can't. Where do you go? What do you do? Right? And
I disagree with that.
Okay.
But continue. I'll give you my
that's my view there, because to me, the moment that you start introducing the basic plot hooks, even if it's just, okay, my character has this background, and based on that background they have this aim and this goal, and I introduce the options for them to follow up on those goals, to me that's already less than sandboxy. It may feel sandboxy because you have the choice to do that or anything else in the world, but if there's one choice that clearly stands out above all the others, is it truly a sandbox, or is it really just an illusion? So I wouldn't call sandbox the opposite of railroading. I would say, indeed, having enough parallel tracks to be able to say, okay, you can go on any of these tracks, and you can steer on the tracks as well. That's why it's called railroading, probably, because the track can only go like that. But let's say that you can actually drive and steer, then you can still kind of go off the track. As long as you stay near it, you're doing good. And then you just provide multiple tracks, and that's the opposite of railroading to me, whereas railroading is exactly one track that you can't steer on, and you're just sitting in a train watching the landscape pass by, which is the DM telling you a story. So that would be my take, but you wanted to disagree with me about sandboxes, so please tell.
So I guess it's because of my own, well, obviously it's because of my own perspective, but I see the sandbox as kind of the default starting point. And so what I'm always trying to get is the pure sandbox.
Right.
And on your point of a sandbox doesn't have the plot hooks that you need in order to have an interesting journey for the player. I would say that if you fill your sandbox with enough things going on, and from experience, you know those things are going to be creating conflict and interest and story, then you just have a very lively, interactive sandbox already, without considering the players. You're just dropping them into something that's a lot more full of life than a sandbox.
I think, interestingly enough, I don't disagree with that at all. But I think that where I'm stumbling is the definition of sandbox, which for me apparently has taken on quite a negative connotation. In the sense that for me, sandbox is lacking even that conflict, or at least not making those conflicts and those situations obvious enough to become plot hooks. Because, like I said, the moment that you have those plot hooks, for me, it's not necessarily a sandbox. It's more being at the station with those multiple tracks that you can go down and steer on. Because, yeah, it's... so I think it really lies in the definition of the word sandbox. Because for me, yeah, a sandbox is by default empty. And that's probably where I'm stumbling. So,
it's probably it's probably because I'm coming from a game industry point of view where a sandbox game has set interactions built into it.
Yeah.
So you're expected to drive around and run over pedestrians, or you're expected to be able to grab a car and steal it. Those things are interactions that are planned into the sandbox, and the sandbox is really. It's not just a box of sand. It's a box of sand with a little bucket and a spade and all the tools that you need to have fun.
Yeah.
Which is the sort of game design sandbox point of view.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess that's one perspective, but also the other perspective where you and I differ slightly is, I know something that I put into the world might be considered a plot hook, and I don't like it. I don't like the idea of plot hooks.
Okay.
For me, that feels like cheating, and I try my best to create characters and situations and sort of motivations and conflict that naturally creates plot hooks without me designing them into this is the kind of thing that will lead the player from A, B, C, D. So when we were talking about A, B, C, D, E, I don't like A, B, C, D either. I try to avoid having those stages.
Right.
I prefer everything to be organic if possible.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, and I like to talk in terms of plot hooks because it helps me understand sort of, if we view, lots of analogies, but if we view it more as a highway, and the plot is a highway and the players can get onto that plot at any given on-ramp, then for me those on-ramps are just the entry points into the story. Those are the plot hooks, and they're not necessarily made to specifically entice the players, but at the same time I want to remain really aware of those points so that when the players do get on, that I can provide them the experience that I want them to have if that happens. So it's I think for me it's a matter of wanting to be prepared to be able to make sure that they don't immediately drive off the other side of the highway again by accident, which would be unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think listening to your perspective and sort of semi-listening to my own perspective while I'm saying it, I think the most important thing is you've got to know your players, and what I'm talking about is definitely not ideal for a lot of players. There are a lot of players who have joined a session or a campaign that I've been running, and they have hated the fact that there's nothing obvious to do, that I'm giving them so much choice that they have to make a decision for themselves.
Yeah.
Which sounds bad. What I mean is, there are some players who are in it for a different experience to the one that I'm providing. So they either want very clear combat, that they're going to go from event to event to event, and each one has a clear fight that they're going to get into, or they're looking for those plot hooks that you mentioned to be sort of handed to them in a very movie story way, like an obvious dramatic scripting device that they can grab hold of, rather than my sort of here's some grey area, where do you want to go? Which is why I tend to.
I love that approach though, but I think I'm definitely also, I think you found out as a player I'm someone I just like to poke at things, so I think that fits in very well with the Ruined Keep. So we think that as a whole is a trend that works really well in a world like that. But can I then ask, right? Do you ever have a backup? Where if let's say your current group of players on the Ruined Keep, let's say they really ran into a dead end and they're just kind of stuck and they can't really poke their way out of it, or they're not finding the places to poke, and you can see that the players are getting, hypothetically speaking, getting restless or aimless and
frustrated.
Frustrated. Yeah. Do you have a backup, or do you deliberately not do that because it might set a precedent that you don't want to set?
I have a technique. Because it's a problem. If you run my style of DMing, you will definitely encounter this problem. There will be a downtime when the players are kind of in between events and they're not sure what to do next.
Yeah,
and they're talking in circles and they get frustrated. And my technique is to thanks for that. Yes, you can always poke your way out with a big sword.
Yeah.
My technique is, having seen the characters in effect sit around getting frustrated, is to start giving them information that their characters might be able to clue into that they as players haven't. So quite often the reason they're stuck is because they've missed something. There was some key piece of evidence or information that will get them back on track of whatever they wanted to achieve.
Yeah.
And so I get them to roll. So I'll say something like, "Ooh, Adelbert, do you want to roll intelligence?" And then if they get a good roll, then I'll give them that piece of information, and that will immediately sort of unlock them a little bit. And sometimes, if you go to worst case scenario, you give them that information, you do it like 4 times, and the players still don't feel like they have enough to make a decision on. You've then got NPCs you can bring in. There's lots of different methods, but without any sort of change to the world.
Okay.
It's more using the tools that you've got in front of you.
But can I then ask, as an outsider, but listening to that is very similar to how I would introduce, what I would call a plot hook. So, do you see a difference, or rather, when you talk about plot hooks, what is the difference between what you view as a plot hook and what this technique does?
So part of the difference is the players.
Okay.
So Horatia is one of them. A plot hook for me, I always think of like a meat hook. So a great big piece of metal with a nasty spike on the end, and you're just lifting the player up and dropping them on this meat hook. And if I introduce this big spike in to the players like Horatia will instinctively not want to do it. They, especially as we've played together so often and such a long time, I think we know each other too well to get away with a blatant plot hook, unless it's one, as you said, that they're interested in.
Right.
So,
do you have an example of that large of a plot hook? Something that you might have thought of that you discarded because it was too obvious?
I've got a very recent example of how plot hooks work in my world.
Okay.
So in episode 1, Serene arrives, one of the NPCs arrives and says that they're looking for this princess.
Yeah.
It's a bit more complicated than that, but I'll simplify it. And they ask Horatia and the rest of the Ruined Keep to have a look for them as well, and then if they spot the princess, to let them know. And I knew that just with that request, Horatia, especially with the character that Chris Roberts is playing, would make some kind of bullish effort to do something about that. To either stop her achieving her goal, to run off and find the princess first, or in some way try and do something against this NPC because they'd had an encounter that had been they were in conflict.
Right.
So whatever this NPC said and wanted to do, I knew Horatia would want to stop them or do the opposite or something.
Right.
So that for me that's the equivalent of a plot hook.
Okay.
I didn't know what they'd do with it. I just knew they would do something with it, and it would be entertaining, and I would enjoy sort of seeing where they went.
But you knew roughly a direction that it would go into based on your knowledge of the player and character, right?
No, they could have just sunk her ship. Like there are so many different things that they could have done that I wasn't entirely sure that they would actually go off and try and find the princess for themselves. Although that was quite an obvious kind of. Yeah. That was say option A most likely. But
did you ever expect them to just help that character outright?
No.
Right. So so you did eliminate part of it, right? You knew that like that part wouldn't happen, I guess.
Only because I know the player and how they play. Right.
I'm just trying to get back because I just want to ask you. What do you think? It's easier to railroad a player you know well, or one that you don't know?
I think it's easier to guide a player in a direction that you prefer them to go to, if you know them well.
Mm-hmm.
Which is to say, not railroading them. I think the temptation is to railroad people because you don't know your players very well. For me as a DM, if you know your players well, you don't need railroading. Would it be easier to railroad a player you know well? I'm trying to imagine a situation where I am doing it, which is quite hard.
Become evil Simon.
Yeah. I think it would be harder. For me, it'd be harder because I would know how much the players would hate it.
Right.
Like if I'm a player who doesn't want to railroad the players, and I naturally therefore gather players who don't want to be railroaded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which means that I think they would all hate it.
So, on on the topic of railroading being easier or harder, I think the interesting thing for me is that it's probably something that is natural for newer dungeon masters. Like, you say it's something that you do naturally when you don't know the players very well, but I think that's also something, even when you play with newer players, if you're an experienced dungeon master, it's easier not to railroad them because you can anticipate more of what the players will do, so you feel less inclined. Because actually, throughout this discussion, I've kind of been mulling it over, and I think railroading is also sort of, the negative railroading where you really force them down one path or into one train that just drives on and on, no matter what. That you do that when you're afraid of encountering a situation that you can't handle, right?
You're not prepared for.
Yeah, that it goes off track and that your improv skills aren't going to be sufficient. And I have to imagine that when you're a new dungeon master, then that's a lot scarier. And I mean, I know it was for me. So when you want to have that safety, you want to keep players within a certain boundary, and that boundary is much narrower than when you have more experience. And so it's easier to railroad players when you're newer, from the perspective of it's easier because then you have less to fear. You can just focus on the story that you prepared and the story that you want to tell because you know that story, and you don't have to deal with the insecurities and the anxieties of telling, something completely new. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think to an extent I would probably advise a new DM to move the scale down towards railroading, because you have to have a lot of confidence and experience to fully improvise and be prepared for players going away from your plot.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of effort to have a world around the players that's ready for that as well. And if you haven't done that effort, you're not experienced enough to improvise it, then you could end up in a situation where you don't know what to do next as a DM. You don't know what to say or what to give the players. And I think a new DM probably should have more of a single track, or I would sort of advise them to do that, just to help them with preparation and things like that.
Yeah.
But I totally agree. I think it's a trap that new DMs will definitely fall into.
Yeah, I agree, and I think probably many, there are exceptions, but many of the horror stories that you hear on places like Reddit, um, anytime that those discussions come up, either it's a mismatch between DM and group, or it's a newer
Mm.
DM who just kind of panicked and goes like, I don't want to deal with the insecurities. So I think that's probably a really good piece of advice. And also on the topic of scaling down, I think scaling down can really help because when you have a huge world, right? Like let's say you start with a world like yours or mine, right away, then I can imagine you immediately feel like you need to go through it on a certain path because there's so many possible unknowns. So scaling down where your players start and what they deal with, an adventure like Lost Mine is excellent because like it sets a boundary, but it's still large enough that it has a little bit of everything, and the players have freedom to choose within that boundary, even if beyond that you might not be prepared for them to go to Waterdeep or whatever. So
Yeah,
I think
that's a really good point. I would definitely say, why not start your if you're creating a homebrew world and a homebrew story. So if you're starting from scratch, why not create your story beginning in the smallest possible village in the middle of nowhere? Because that will simplify your tasks so much. I totally agree. That's a good way of starting it. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to follow up with a question because I think it ties in quite well. But I had a question prepared about, I don't know if you have any, but if you have any larger, plot arcs or structures roughly in mind for, okay, let's say this is an act. I know that might go against your sandbox philosophy, so that's why I'm, emphasizing maybe. But if you have any plot arcs roughly in mind when you start preparing for, the next session or the next 5 sessions or for the campaign, how do you reconcile that with a sandboxy environment, especially the way that you like to run it? How do you get those two to kind of link up together?
I always think in hierarchies. So the events that are happening around the player's immediate will often show themselves through NPCs that are very low level.
Yeah.
And then above those NPCs are higher level NPCs and so on. And ultimately, you've got countries doing things. And then if you have a bigger universe, you've got deities, gods, and worlds, and so on. And so all these things are creating events that are occurring.
Yeah.
So for me, the story is these massive events that can occur because of conflict and drama between these larger entities, and that maintains the sandbox. You're just going up to a higher level of intrigue, if you like.
Right.
And so that side of things is hierarchical. Then Beluga mentioned something which I think is really important, which is that I've just clicked on something, I can't see it now. The railroading is often because the DM isn't focusing on the player's story or the player's background and is focusing on their own. And I think even if you're running a sandbox like mine, you need to also be thinking about how the player's characters are going to develop.
Yeah.
And that is much more. You were talking about at the beginning push and pull. The push for me is, here's my sandbox in your face. I'm pushing these events at you. You can do what you like with them. That's the push. And then the pull is, your character wants to go in this direction. That's interesting. Or you created this in your backstory. Oh, that's going to fit with these events over here.
Yeah.
And there's this pull of like, I want you as a player and your character to have this interesting arc. So then you start trying to see how these big events might affect that arc as well.
Yeah.
That's how I would do it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think because when I first started my first campaigns in 2017, I was really focused on my story. I wasn't railroading anyone, but it's just the only thing I had at the time, and I had asked the players to prepare a number of backstories, and thankfully, we very quickly discovered that my story was good, but it was much more interesting to focus on their stories. So I didn't abandon it, but I definitely let it play second fiddle until the players chose, okay, our backstories are kind of resolved to the point that the two come together, and then that was just the story going forward. But I completely agree that player backstories is, I mean, it's also such a rich source of information, right? Because not only do you get inspiration from what the players are writing for their character backstories, but it's also a very clear indication of what the players want to be doing or are interested in, especially if they're relatively extensive. I don't expect pages, but I definitely want a little more information than was born in X and is now in Y. And once you have that, I think it's such a, I think it's a resource that really shouldn't be ignored. But yeah, I completely agree.
So I have a question, which is from my surprise question.
Oh, okay.
How much do you enjoy being surprised as a player, and do you think railroading allows you to have such an experience?
So you mean me as a player in like
Yeah.
someone else's game? Okay. Are you quizzing me for the Rune Keep?
No?
No, but I think it's a cool question. I love to be surprised,
Mm.
but I also love to be surprising. Like as I described earlier, I love to kind of poke at things, and I love to try to find, not to annoy the dungeon master, but to do the thing that, to find maybe the secret, or to find the little thing in the space of the scene where somebody goes, oh, I would have never thought of doing that, but I did that. That's what I like to kind of poke at. And then in return, I love to be surprised as well, because then you get to poke at new things, right? It's like I'm preparing this whole scene, and I'm sitting and listening and interacting, and in between I'm thinking about, do I want to say this? Do I want to ask that? Or do I want to search here? And then something unexpected happens, and maybe the world moves on like you described, but then I get to react to that as well. So I think if you're engaged with the story and you get enough freedom to express your own, curiosities, and to poke at everything to feel like, the boundaries aren't there, then it's also very nice to be surprised, because then, that kind of creates that sense of motion, I think, where things are moving forward because you're poking, and the DM is also showing that the world is moving on at the same time.
It's an interesting question from Tempest. Question, Simon, do you ever get told you're doing it wrong when you talk about your methods?
Well,
well, Tempest, this kind of conversation that we're having right now on stream is not something I've done very often. I think the campaigns that I've run and the sort of groups that I've been in, I tend to be ADM, and then I have a bunch of players, and we don't really talk about DM style very much. So talking with another DM has generally been, say, down the pub when you meet somebody and they go, "Oh, I'm a DM," and you go, "Oh, that's interesting," but you never get to the deep level that Kevin and I got to very quickly, and have the opportunity to have these conversations. So, firstly, I don't think I've ever been in a situation where somebody's really heard enough about my methods to then say that's wrong. But I have had players say I'm doing something wrong. Different players with different criticisms. So yes, I have had players say that, and I've had quite long conversations, sometimes on like social media, text or whatever, and sometimes in person. And I've tried to explain to them calmly and without taking offense why I do the things that I do. But ultimately, my viewpoint is this is my table, my rules, and I've invited the players into my story with the understanding that once they've arrived, I then pay attention to their story and what they want.
Yeah.
And it's then a two-way street. But the first point of contact is, this is how I do things. And ultimately, if people don't like how I do things, then they don't play. And there's not much I can do about that, because while I will constantly try and improve and do a better job in the style that I play, this is how I want to play, so this is how I am playing.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's that's kind of my attitude.
No, I think that's a good attitude overall. It's obviously everything can be taken too far, but I think that in general, in this whole how to DM space, there's so much room to do things your way and to find
completely.
a group that suits you. That there are only very few things, such as, for example, Indeed. I think one of the few things you could do completely wrong is if you are completely railroading. If you're just telling a story and the players are just along for the ride, unless you're telling an interactive novel sort of thing, where they just make a few choices, unless that's your specific social contract for that game, that is probably wrong. But outside of that, I think that there's almost no wrong way to DM as long as you make sure that your players are on the same wavelength as you. Then,
So Tempest, Kevin's just kind of answered. Not answered. He's addressed what you just said. There is no wrong way, except for certain social problems that you might get into. So obviously, if you insult people, or if you take away agency from the player, so you start controlling their character, there's a bunch of things you can do wrong. But in terms of sort of general DM style, you just find players who like your style.
Yeah.
And no matter what your style is, I mean, even the sort of interactive novel that you just described, I can definitely imagine
it could work for some people. Yeah.
Some people aren't interested in the story; they just want combat. In which case, that kind of interactive novel approach might be quite good for them.
Yeah.
Who knows? I could imagine that being a thing. But yeah, I'm sorry you've been told off.
That is rough.
No DM should ever really tell another DM off unless, as I said, they're breaking some kind of social engagement rules. Don't insult or whatever.
I think discussions around topics like DM style can often turn into DMs trying to convince each other that their style is better, and I see it much more. When we're on Twitter, for example, and we're talking about, I would do this or that. I'll share my opinion, but if somebody disagrees, I go like, okay, then you do it your way. I'm not here to. I think the most interesting thing about seeing these discussions about DM style is that you listen to what other people do, you consider what you do, and then you see if you want to take inspiration from that. But you should never really copy what somebody else is doing anyway, because you should find the way that works the best for you, and that's never going to be exactly what works for another DM, because you are you and you're not them.
Yeah, and also, Tempest, I would argue that the most important thing is for you to get to know your players and kind of have a style that everyone is enjoying. And if that's the case, and you see this all the time in DM Academy on Reddit, the ultimate answer is often the best D&D is the D&D that table enjoys. And it doesn't matter what anyone else around the world is saying. As long as your table enjoys it, then it's good.
Definitely.
But yeah, if you ever need backup, if somebody's telling you off and you need backup, then I'm happy to jump in and then explain in the same way.
Just tag us on Twitter, and we'll come running like Team Rocket.
We'll be your backup if you need it.
I did have a fun secret question that I have remembered since I lost my document, unfortunately. But I don't know if have you encountered railroading yourself as a player in someone else's game?
Yes, and I actually had the same question for you. So it's good that we put this down. Yeah, I've had 2 or 3 occasions when, as a player, I've either felt railroaded or I was pretty sure, even objectively, that railroading was happening. And I hate it. It immediately puts me off the game.
Yeah.
There was one game where a number of us felt that we were being railroaded, and we literally just abandoned the game. As players, we didn't want to continue playing. And I think that can often be the cause of a D&D group falling apart, because the players and the DM don't like each other's style, which can happen all the time.
Okay.
And yeah, I've had it a few times, and the reason I don't like it is, for me, D&D, the special thing about D&D is the freedom to choose in a fantasy world where the consequences are very different to the real world.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that choice, then I don't feel like playing. It
Mm.
doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that.
Personally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I
Have
wanted to
you?
follow up actually. Well,
Oh, okay.
sorry, no, but just a real a real
Yeah.
quick follow up question was, let's say I'm gathering that mostly you just got out of those games if it happened, and I'm guessing it wasn't that frequent.
Yeah.
But let's say you were in a game with a dungeon master that you like, and usually you enjoy their stories, but you encounter this problem, or let's say somebody else is in that situation. How would you deal with that situation? How do you address a DM that's railroading you? Like, do you think that there are methods that you can apply to sort of come to a conclusion, or do you think that once you get railroaded in a way that you're not happy with, you just have to acknowledge that that's a difference in style and you guys are just not a match?
That's a really hard question for me to answer because I'm not an experienced player.
Mm-hmm.
I've basically been a DM since I was a teenager.
Okay. Yeah.
And out of the 30 years or so, that's probably more. I have only played a few games, so I really haven't had a lot of experience. But I would, if I had a friend who was in that situation, and they'd enjoyed the story up until that point, and they'd enjoyed playing, and then suddenly they felt railroaded. It depends on if it feels like it's going to keep going, because it might be a temporary thing where maybe the DM didn't have time to prepare that week, and so they had to rush things through, or maybe there was something really crucial that they were worried about losing from the plot entirely. So I'd probably talk to that friend and see if we could work out why the DM was doing that.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, if they enjoy it enough, then they should talk to the DM and just say, "I felt like you were railroading us. Is there anything else we could have done, or is that actually a style you want to keep going? Because I'm not enjoying it." I mean, ultimately, as a player, you have to. I've been really happy that I've had players come to me and actually complain. I think the worst scenario is when the players and the DM, nobody's happy and nobody's talking.
Yeah.
The best snow is if somebody is unhappy with something and they come to you and say, "I don't like this," or even better, if you've checked in with them as a DM and said, "Are you enjoying the sessions?" And
I
think I haven't done that for a while. But.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And as for me, well, I have an interesting answer to this question because I started DMing because I felt like I was getting railroaded in every game.
Interesting. Yeah.
So when I really started getting into D&T, I was already, in terms of role playing, I was experienced, but not tabletop role playing. So I knew how to kind of perform a character, and I knew how to tell a story, and even DM to a degree. But I had never played tabletop role playing games before, so I didn't know all the limitations of a dungeon master that's not comfortable with the mechanics, or if their world is just smaller, because I'd always played in established worlds. And I played, I think, so this was in 2016, I played in like 3 or 4 different games over the course of 4 months. I tried every time to join, and every time it would be, I would try to do the thing that I do in your game as well, poke at things and ask weird questions and try to get into some sort of deeper meaning of things, and in your world that exists, but in their worlds, they were newer dungeon masters, so this is not a slight to any of those dungeon masters or players that I played with at the time, but that depth wasn't there, so there wasn't enough room to really start poking around in things, and I grew so frustrated, and I was like, the only game that at the time that I truly want to play in was my own, the one that I could envision having. So I was like, then I have to run it, right? I don't have a choice. I have to be running it in order to give the experience that I want to have myself. And then I fell in love with DMing, obviously. So it's not like I'm secretly pining away to be a player, but I have found now several dungeon masters, including you and Nicola, who can provide that experience as well, which is amazing. But yes, in general, I run away the moment I feel railroaded. But I don't think it's the dungeon masters necessarily doing it to me. It's more just I want to look for so much meaning and layers in things that you have to have an expansive world prepared and ready to go, to be able to sustain that in a player, I think.
It's interesting because I guess the other side of it is that you and I probably as DMs like detail,
Yeah.
and we like being able to provide detail.
Yeah.
And I imagine that there are a lot of DMs who are much more interested in a broad sweeping story that has pace and movement and drama and other features to it.
Yeah.
And not get bogged down by detail. And I've had players who get bored with that kind of stuff. So when other players start discussing the detail in my world, you can see one player just switching off because that's one thing they're not interested in. All they want is the higher sort of story and then the combat. So yeah, I imagine for quite a few DMs, it's just not a priority, which is
fair. It's whatever works for everyone, and again comes back to making sure that you have players that match your style and your style matches the players, and making sure that you guys are,
But it also, what you just said, reminded me of a question that maybe we should. Thanks, Rathia. Thanks. For this. That we should probably end with, which is railroading ever good? Because in the scenario you just suggested, railroading turned you into a DM, and so the world has benefited. We now have Tales of Adir, which we wouldn't have had if you hadn't been railroaded. So,
is railroading ever good? I think so. I think within, especially the definitions, loose definitions that we've talked about of having it as a scale and being able to provide multiple paths, but still a sort of managed sandbox, for example. I think, especially if everything is some form of guiding or guidance, and that goes up to railroading, some form of it is typically present and can be considered very good because it gives players the framework to be able to actually move through the world and advance stories in whatever way that they want to. It's just that the extremes are, as usual, the extremes are bad. So that would be my opinion. But with your approach to sandboxes, do you disagree?
Well, the context for me answering the question, I think, is was it Carlos, the player at the end of I'm trying to get the name.
Carlos, with Core, who was arrested.
Core.
Yeah.
That sequence, I think, could be constituted as railroading because you had to arrest Core, take them to court, and then pronounce judgment in a way that would then round off the story. So all of those elements are railroading to an extent. They're predetermined. The players don't have a lot of impact on them, and there's a very strong encouragement from in a sort of group dynamic not to break that agreement. It's like if Turnok had just run off and started hacking up the guards or something, then you wouldn't have had a good ending for Core, and that would be a shame for that player. And everyone understood that agreement, and so they went along with it, but it still was railroading. And in that situation, I think it's good. I think there are some scenes, for instance, where you want them to play out in a certain way, and everyone understands that more drama and story can come out of it if they just let the DM railroad them a bit. So I think there are moments in a session where you are effectively taking over, and the players become spectators to an extent. As long as they feel like they have an opportunity to make a choice, then I think it's fine. So I think that's good.
I think, honestly, that's a really interesting point. Sorry, I know we're trying to get towards an end, but I could talk to you for hours. But on that topic, right, I think that there is also a situation where if you know an event must take place in the story, you have decided that this part of the story must transpire in a certain way, then it's also more honest towards the players to simply acknowledge that and say, okay, this is a scene where you're just entering in towards the end of an assassination. Like, the character is dead, they're gone, you cannot save them. What do you do next? And then by acknowledging that, okay, you were never supposed to have a choice in the first place, so this is the scene and let's go. You kind of, smooth over the whole, okay, but we wanted to have a choice, because you already in subtext communicate, that this particular thing you simply couldn't change, so don't worry about it. What are you going to do next? Which I think is also a lesson that especially I think for new DMs, can be really helpful, because if you can acknowledge those few scenes, please keep them few, but if you can acknowledge those few scenes where that has to happen, then that's also a lot more fair to the players, where they can just start reacting to whatever has to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would also sort of reference the videos you get in games. So when you're playing a video game and it goes to an FMV, especially Japanese games often take complete control, and you can't do anything for 10 minutes and you're just watching this video. These days they often have a warning saying you need to put aside some time to watch this or whatever. I totally agree. I think if you're going to have these moments of railroading, and you're going to have them infrequently, when you do have them, give the players some kind of indication that's what's happening. Even if it's just a light-hearted comment like, I'm sorry that there's going to be a little bit of a scene here. You're not going to be able to do much. Or if that is your style and that's how you want to play the game, then also bring that up at session 0 and say, I like to have these big dramatic scenes where there's not a lot of interaction. I hope that's okay. Something like that.
Yeah.
I think that's worth doing as well. Yeah, that's
definitely.
a really good point. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well,
Cool.
Simon, thank you so much for being here today with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
This was super fun, and I think we have enough planned to talk probably for another 6 hours. So I hope we do this again very soon. I
was going to say the next part of this topic is how to railroad.
Oh God, yeah. Just make the world's worst DM guide to railroading.
Ooh.
That would be fun to put on YouTube.
Yeah.
We should talk about that. But I think in our current planning, we're planning on recording the next session in 2 weeks, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, then I'm going to say to everyone who watched or is watching or will be watching this later, thank you so much for being here with us until this point. And we will be recording more soon, more DM chats and topics that will hopefully be interesting and relevant for Dungeon Masters, new and old, to learn from. And we hope to see you next time as well.
Cool. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.